Welcome back, students. In this video we're going to continue to talk about the creation of the Mongol Empire. And so at the end of the last video we'd ended the campaigns of Ogedei. Ogedei is the successor of Genghis Khan. He takes the Mongol military machine and he extends and exports it to into Europe and to Eastern Europe, and it's very successful. But then when he dies, the Mongol army returns to Mongolia. And under Mongke, the Mongols are going to move into the Middle East. And in 1258, they come before the city of Baghdad, still the capital city ruled by the Abbasid caliphs. And we haven't talked about the Abbasids for some time. They're still seen as the religious leaders of Sunni Muslims throughout the world, connecting them back to Muhammad. All the different Turkic peoples that we talked about, most of whom converted to Sunni Islam, also accepted them as the legitimate successors of Muhammad. So religiously they're very important. Politically they're much less important. They only really directly influence and rule the city of Baghdad. But they have this great religious significance and they have great wealth. They're in a city which is one of the largest and the wealthiest cities in the world. However, even they are unable to resist the Mongols. And when the Mongols capture Baghdad, they sack the city in the way the Mongols sack every city that they capture, with great violence and destruction. And so we have the death of the last Abbasid caliph. And so the caliph is starved to death. This is an image of this happening. And any kind of unity in the Sunni Muslim world kind of disappears with him. From now on, unity and authority in Islam is going to be based on military power, not on religious authority. It's important to remember that it took Europe 600 years to recover from the fall of Rome, and this is a much more devastating sack, and it's as though the Pope had been killed and not replaced when the Visigoths had sacked Rome. This is a huge event when it comes to the unity of Islamic culture in the Islamic world. So the loss of the Abbasid Caliph. Even more worrying, the destruction, or even more consequential, is the destruction of the great library in Baghdad. Remember, this has been the greatest library that brought together the wisdom, the most important texts from around the world, from the Mediterranean, from the Middle East, from India, from China, and it's totally destroyed by the Mongols. The Mongols who don't care about learning in the same way at all. And we're told that the river Euphrates, which runs through the city of Baghdad, ran black with ink from all the books and all the learning that was being washed away. And with this washing away, the Islamic world's leadership of the world is also washed away. And so they lose their ability, or they lose the prestige that they had held as the center of education and learning in the world. That ends with the Mongol sack. At the same time, the Mongols also destroy the infrastructure around the city. We're told that they salted the fields around the city, destroyed the irrigation systems the Abbasids had used to make this a productive land. They killed and enslaved too many of the inhabitants for these systems to be rebuilt and for the population to rebound. And so Iraq, the Middle East, modern day Iraq, modern day Middle East, that had been the center of this flourishing Islamic civilization, is destroyed. And the Islamic Middle East is radically reshaped by the Mongol invasions as a result of this sack. And so it's become weaker and more divided than it's been for a number of centuries. If we look further to the east, if we look further to the west and into Egypt, we discover that the Ayyubids had succeeded Saladin. When Saladin dies, his sons succeeded him and gave their name to this new Ayyubid dynasty. However, they had become increasingly dependent on Mamluk slave soldiers. And these are Turkish slave soldiers. Now, they're often the Khwarezmians who had fled from Genghis Khan, who flee away from their empire that has been destroyed, this Persian Sultanate that was destroyed, and they become mercenaries for the Ayyubids. Now, they're known as slave soldiers in the sense that they didn't enjoy the same rights as citizens, but they nevertheless led very comfortable lives. They provided the Ayyubids with an elite and reliable military force. Nevertheless, the First Crusade of Louis IX had caused tensions. The Ayyubids were angry with the Mamluks for not doing better at defending the city of Damietta, and they were increasingly worried that the Mamluks were becoming too powerful. And so the new Sultan, Turan Shah, tries to weaken the Mamluks. He was also said to be pretty mentally unstable. We have stories of him running around, cutting the tops off the candles and shouting in his great chamber and shouting that this was what he was going to do to the Mamluks. So that kind of gives the game away. It's kind of hard to set yourself up to weaken your most powerful mercenary military force if you're shouting about doing it beforehand. So the Mamluks knew what was coming, and they assassinated Turan Shah under the leadership of a man named Baibars. Baibars, who's going to be very important. It's Baibars who had turned the tide against the crusade of Louis IX. Now he removes the last of the Ayyubid sultans, but the Mamluks did not initially seize power. Instead, they frame this as an act of Muslim piety. That Turan Shah was mentally unstable, was not fit to be a leader of armies that represented Islam in the fight against heretics and the fight against the Christians. And so instead, they sought for a successor among the Ayyubids and chose a woman named Shaja al-Dur. And so she becomes the Sultan, despite also having been a former slave. Shaja nevertheless knows where the power really is. She's become the Sultan because she's an Ayyubid. It's a way for the Mamluks to present their assassination of Turan Shah not as a political coup, but as an act of piety. And this speaks to our theme of religion that we're focusing on in this course. Nevertheless, she knows that she needs the support of the Mamluks. And so she marries one of the Mamluks named Aybak. By 1257, however, they both become extremely jealous and nervous of each other. You can imagine how much pressure there was on this marriage. And each one starts trying to make alliances that will enable them not to have to rely on the other. That's very bad for a marriage. And Shaja has Aybak assassinated and claims that she was innocent, but the Mamluks refuse to believe her and have her thrown off the top of a tower, and that brings the Ayyubid dynasty to an end. The Mamluks now seize control of Egypt, but the fact that this guy Aybak had been married to Shaja had given them legitimacy to seize control of the region, even if the caliphs had a problem with them. So you have the Abbasid caliphs miles away in Baghdad. They're still the religious leaders. They could object to the overthrowing of the Ayyubid sultans, who had been leaders in efforts to expand Islam against the Crusaders. Even if the caliphs had objected to this, the next year, you can see this in 1257, in 1258, the Mongols are going to sack Baghdad. And so from now on, at the moment, at least, the Mamluks are the only power left in the Islamic world. They've achieved this position of power based on their military strength. That, with the fall of the last Abbasid caliph, is now the main source of religious legitimacy as well as political legitimacy in Islam. So that's the Mamluks. The Mamluks have established themselves in control of Egypt. Mongols have established themselves in the Middle East. What about the Crusaders? Medieval Crusaders and medieval Europeans were initially very interested and quite excited by the advances of the Mongols. They had hoped that these Mongols would fulfill the myth of Prester John, the idea that there is a successor of one of the three wise men from the story of Christmas who rule a long-lost Christian kingdom, either in East Africa or in India or further to the east, and that there was a prophecy that Prester John would come to the help of medieval Europe and he would he would help them defeat the Muslims and regain control of the Holy Land. And so when they start to hear about the Mongols, they wonder if this is the fulfillment of the prophecy. And we're told that Louis IX and the Pope of the time both write to Pope of the time, who is Innocent IV, both write to the leader of the Mongols, the Mongol Khan, and suggest, let's make an alliance against these Muslims, and why don't you convert to Christianity? But the Khan wrote back, we don't need your help, and we have no plans to convert, and you're going to be our slaves as well. And so there's a growing recognition that among the Crusaders, the Mongols are not going to be their friends any more than the Muslim rulers of the Middle East have been their friends. But first, the Mongols are going to duke it out with the Mamluks, who at this point are the far greater threat to their power. And so they send emissaries to the Mamluks demanding their submission. And the Mamluk ruler had them killed and prepared for war. It's pretty bold. You're taking on the Mongols. They just sank the greatest city in the region. You're this new ruling dynasty. You're willing to take your chances and to take on the power of the Mongols. However, it was an opportune time. Mongke had died. There was civil war in Mongolia. Some of the Mongols said, we have to do what we've always done as Mongols. When the Khan dies, we return to Mongolia. We put an end to the civil war. We elect a new ruler. Then we return. But others said, now we're a powerful empire. We don't have to do that in Mongolia. And we're the army. We should stay here, and we should have an election for a new Khan from the army. That's the most important part. That's been the foundation for our success. And then once we've done that, we'll continue to fight these Mamluks. And so there's division, and some of the Mongols leave and return to Mongolia. And so the two forces meet in 1260 at the Battle of Iron Falut. This is one of the most significant battles in world history in the 13th century. The Mamluks are commanded by this figure Baibars, who had helped remove the Ayyubids, who had helped defeat Louis IX. He concentrated on hit-and-run tactics throughout the day to frustrate the Mongols and avoid committing his forces. After many hours, Mamluks pretend to flee away again, and this time when the Mongols follow them, their reserve forces break out from where they've been hiding and encircle the Mongols. And despite the Mongols fighting fiercely to break out of the encirclement, and the Mamluk Sultan having to take off his helmet and show that he's fighting at the forefront, and the Mamluks need to fight with him, the Mongols are defeated. The battle is significant because it ensures that the Mamluks will remain the rulers of Egypt and the most powerful influence in the Middle East, and it limits the spread of the Mongols. If the Mongols had been successful here, the whole of Africa and the Middle East left open to them to add to their already enormous empire that covered most of Asia. But that did not happen. So the Battle of Iron Falut is important because it secures the Mamluks in their role as military rulers of the region, and because it prevents the spread of the Mongols. It establishes the boundaries of the Mongol Empire. On the way back to Cairo, Baibars, who had been the general at this battle, assassinates the Sultan and seizes power himself. Now this was bad news for the Crusaders, who'd maintained a sort of uneasy neutrality in the war between the Mamluks and the Mongols. They don't really like either of them and don't really trust either of them. Baibars becoming the Sultan, the Mamluks defeating the Mongols, is bad news for the Crusaders because Baibars is a very effective general and he's committed to removing the last of the Christians from the Middle East and ruling over all of Egypt, Syria, and Palestine. And this is for both religious reasons and for political reasons. In the 1260s, he captured many of the remaining Crusader strongholds and conducted, by the way, many of the worst massacres of the Crusading campaigns, boasting of his soldiers' brutality. So people who look at the Crusades tend to focus on Crusader sacks, such as the sack of Jerusalem or the sack of Constantinople. Those that Baibars carries out during this period are far, far more bloody and brutal, and there's no sense of shame about the way Baibars thinks about these sacks. He thinks that they're a good thing. In 1289, after Baibars' death, the new Mamluk Sultan led a huge army that finished off the last remaining holdouts in the Crusader-held kingdom in 1291. Remember, the Crusaders had maintained their little strip of territory along the coast of the Middle East for about a century now, since the Battle of Hattin. But in 1291, this ended as well. And so the Latin kingdom of the Crusaders comes to an end. Crusaders had been an epitome of what we call the High Middle Ages.